Hey, hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask Octopus. Today we're missing Derek, so it's just Bob and I going over a few questions we've had in the past couple weeks. How
Hello,
you
everyone.
doing, Bob? Oh,
Good. How
sorry.
you doing? No worries.
Cool. So let's jump into it. And my question was kind of teased in the last video. Last week I talked about how to prevent progression, how to block deployments from moving down the pipeline. And it was really kind of like the first part of the answer to this question. So there was like the simple way you can do it that's kind of supported but may not fit your use case. And this was a very specific use case that I've come across with a few different customers. And that's really they want to require approvals on a deployment before promoting to the next environment. And I think that's a pretty common question we get.
Yeah, I said that's fairly common because it's really they want to block everything by default and only allow certain ones through. Because I mean, very rarely you're going to have a change or release that passes QA on the very first try, unless it's like a very tiny bug fix or something like that.
Right. And it's like if you're doing continuous integration where every build to or every check into a branch generates a package and generates a release in Octopus that goes to a dev environment, not all of those are going to go to QA.
Mm-hmm.
And not everything that goes to QA is going to go to UAT. But with lifecycles, by default, once you successfully deploy to dev, it's available to go to the next environment.
Yeah.
So a couple of suggestions we've given to customers before is you can use manual interventions for this, and it's really two options there. You can put it at the end of your deployment process where you have to go in and then finish approve the deployment to dev
Mm-hmm.
before it's considered successful. Not a great solution because it leaves it never shows as being completed as a deployment until you go in and actually approve it at that point. So it'll show as just pending for a long time.
Yeah, and then you're consumed. Yeah, and then if you look at your running tasks, you're going to see a whole bunch of awaiting interventions, and you're like, well, which one do I actually need to click on?
Right. And if you're doing a deployment for every check into a branch, you also have to go in and cancel or I guess unapprove all of those,
Mm-hmm.
which just is time consuming.
Yeah.
The other way to do it, which is maybe a little bit better, but has a similar problem, is you put the manual intervention at the beginning of your process. And when somebody tries to pull it into QA, then somebody would have to come or QA or UAT, whatever the next environment is, that manual intervention would trigger at that point, and somebody would have to come in and say, yes, this is good to go to UAT or QA or what the environment is. But it's the same thing. You're putting that approval in the deployment part, where what customers are asking for is really to not allow those to be pushed to those environments at all.
Yeah, we kind of, yeah, because place that I used to work, what we would love to do is we did all our deployments at 7 p.m. And so the DBAs and the web admins, they were busy people. They didn't want to be involved with every single last deployment. So all they wanted to do was schedule the deployment to run at say 7 p.m. on a Thursday night, and then it would run it. But it's like I only want to get paged if something bad happened. I don't want to be online. I don't want to have to deal with any of that. So having the approval be at the beginning, you couldn't really do that.
Yeah, exactly. And then one of the customers that I've been talking to about this, they actually they're doing tenanted deployments,
Mm.
which is the example I've set up here because this was kind of based on their scenario. And so their environments are QA. Now that I've created that release, let me go back to the overview. Their environments are, they go to QA, and then once it's been validated in QA, it will go to UAT, which is a customer or a tenanted environment. So it may be customer infrastructure, but
Mm.
they want the customers to actually come in and pick up an available release to deploy to UAT.
Gotcha.
So if I came in and I'm going to deploy I have an internal one, so our QA system's internal. So you can do mixed tenanted and non-tenanted deployments, but I think I've seen you do this as well. I prefer to just set up an internal tenant to represent that.
Yeah, because it's testing exactly how my thought is it's the exact same way that your customers are doing their deployments in this case, and that's how you're testing your deployment. So it's really, to me, is really the consistency. So if you had something like a tenant tag or something like that, you can't really test that with an untenanted deployment.
Right. And then it also sets you up for the future if you're like, oh, well, now that we have this, internal tenant, you could also use that for multiple QA environments, multiple internal environments.
Yeah. Yeah. You could also have multiple internal tenants. You might want to have, you could also have each QA person's their own tenant at that particular point in time if you wanted to do something like that.
Right. Yeah. So with this overview now, so I've deployed this 003 to the QA environment, and you can see it's ready to be deployed. Well, through the interface, it's right. You can go directly to UAT, and this is kind of how Octopus is designed.
Mm-hmm.
Once it's successful, that's how the lifecycle works. You can move it to the next one.
I think the thought is that if you have rights to do the deployment to UAT, this is kind of how we did it at a previous job, is only if you wanted to go to production, only web admins could deploy to production or DBAs could deploy to production. And so that by them doing that and scheduling that, that was quote unquote their approval at that particular point in time.
Right. Yeah. So it's really whoever's pulling it into that environment. They have to have enough information to make that decision and be responsible for it, which I think is probably most cases of people using Octopus. But there are, like in this case, it's the user, the customer tenant pulling a release from QA, and they have all these choices, and they don't know if it's actually been approved or not because they're not part of the company. I mean, there's some communication you can do, but they wanted a built-in process to simulate that.
Oh, we kind of had the same problem with our web admins because they didn't know what version. They didn't know that 003 was the correct version. They may have think 002 is the correct version. And so we always, like anytime we did a deployment, it's like, all right, Mr. Web Admin or Mrs. Web Admin, could you go ahead and schedule this very particular version? And then they're like, okay, now we know. So you had kind of that external you had to have a little bit of external communication outside this tool.
Right. And same thing with just a QA team or a UA team within your company. Devs push a bunch of deployments. The UAT team sees like, oh, there's 5 new deployments or 5 new releases. They all passed on this environment. Which one do I take?
Yeah.
So if I wanted to block this release 003 from going to UAT, I could use the block progression that we talked about last week. The downside of that is to say if I deployed for one customer, let's say we already approved it, it's ready to go to UAT from QA. With this release, I've still got now one customer that hasn't gone to UAT yet. If I block this progression on this release, it blocks it. It doesn't like block it for just going to the next environment that it hasn't been to yet, like production. It blocks it for any deployment. So so it may not be that it's a bad release, which is really what block progression is for. It's a bad release. It's just that it hasn't been approved to go to production yet, but I still want it to be able to go to UAT. And that's where the block progression example broke down in this specific case.
Yeah, that makes sense because that's not their use case. They want to block it from going to production, not block it from going to UAT.
Right. So I came up with an idea. It's not a standard Octopus process, but it works and it solves the problem. So I pitched it to the customer, and I thought it was interesting enough to share with everyone. So let's jump into that. If I go into what I added were 2 new environments, basically approval environments between the environments that I wanted to gate. So I have QA. Now I have a QA approval, UAT approval, production. So pretty simple so far. Set up a life cycle that has all of those environments. And then what I did was when I set up the tenants, actually what I show first, well, I have a separate project that's going to show this, but when I set up the tenants in the approval project, only the internal tenant is able to deploy to are associated with those environments.
That's a good idea. I wasn't even thinking of that.
Yeah, and if you weren't using tenants, if you were just using teams, you could also just say, well, the UAT team doesn't have permission to deploy to those environments. Only whoever has permission to approve those. The same way you would do with a manual intervention, where you say this team can take over this manual intervention. That's who you would assign to do to that or to deploy to that environment. So yeah, so if you look at the other tenants, they're the same. They can only go to the regular ones. Only the internal or whoever the approver is goes to the approval environments. And then if we go in and look at the project, actually come in here. So you see it's a little bit wider. I got 5 environments now, so I got a little bit of scaling going on. The other thing I set up is in the process, all of the main steps I scoped to the real environments, and then I added, and this isn't required, you can really kind of put any step there, but I did add a manual intervention step just to capture notes.
Yep.
And then scoped it to those approval environments.
And then conversely, I mean, if you wanted to, you could just say the install web app and configure web app don't run in the approval environment. So if you have a bunch of other environments, you can just say, I want to skip those.
Yeah, that's right. You could go in and say, I want to skip those environments specifically. So now if I go in, and the way this works, if I go in and create a release, and I'll just go ahead and deploy it to QA, which should be easy enough because it's only internal. And that should be, they're just running scripts that write messages out, so they should be pretty fast.
Okay.
Nope.
There it goes.
So now when we filter, because of the life cycle, it has to go to QA approval first. So it's blocked from going to UAT. So now if I wanted to approve it, I can come in, we say, yes, this is a good release. It's been vetted thoroughly in QA. It's ready for our clients to pull, or it's ready for another team to pull. This will come up with a manual intervention where we can track notes. Like I said, that part's kind of optional. You don't necessarily, maybe the log of somebody deploying to an approval environment is enough.
I could also see those steps. Like I want to have QA approval. So then you'd have a QA sign off and you could actually see, why they signed off or something like that. I think having the manual intervention is probably a good idea, or even having a couple manual interventions at that particular point in time.
It's got to finish. It's got to wait for the
queue
task to pick it back up. Yep. So now that it's been approved, you can see now the customers can come in and pick it up.
Nice.
So I'll go ahead and deploy to them, and it'll be the same thing. Once it's deployed to UAT, it's going to be blocked into, well, not really blocked. It's just not going to be available to production until the internal tenant has it deployed to the UAT approval environment.
Very nice.
Yeah. So nice way to kind of just like add gates in there. And it's, it's like I said, it's not a standard Octopus process, but it's a way you can use some extra environments to move some of those approvals to in between your actual environments.
Yeah, we did this at another previous place I worked at where we had an approval environment, and that we only deployed to that environment at the end of a sprint. So we knew, okay, this, and it had been verified by QA. So like this was a version that we could show to say customers, or this was a version we could show internally to get feedback on. It's not something that's kind of half baked, and we know exactly that it's a good version.
Yeah. I think this is a pretty common scenario. Like you've run into it, like you've mentioned a few times. Customers I've talked to, it comes up a few times. I've talked to 2 recently. I know in the past year it's been a handful. So it was nice. It's like, I don't know what it was, but it was just something in the past couple of weeks. Because usually I'm like, I use manual interventions, and then for some reason this idea popped into my head in the last couple of weeks and put together, and it's. I think it's kind of nice. It's not a bad solution to the problem.
Yeah, and I guess the only kicker is that you do have to be kind of controlled with your environment. So if you're someone that has, say, 100 environments, this is going to be a little bit trickier, and maybe at that point it might be more helpful to look into using tenants for some of those different things, or asking why you have so many environments.
That is true. Yeah. In this example, I only had 3. I think even with like 3 to 5 environments, maybe you don't need an approval gate between all of them, but it's more of like okay, do you need one between each of your environments, and can you get away with a manual intervention in some of the earlier ones, but later in the pipeline you want a true like a stopgap, like a UAT approval.
Yeah, and I know we've discussed at times, like if there's ways we can adjust our life cycles to allow something like this, but I like this solution because it shows how you can use the tool as is, and it works. And I think I really like the manual. I really like that manual intervention step in there. And you could also run a couple other innocuous steps, like maybe you want to download the package and put it on a file share or for archival purposes or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, the options are kind of limitless there. You could do anything like, oh, we know it's been approved in QA. Let's do some prep work, like you said, either pushing some packages to servers preemptively to help out with deployment times, maybe just some processes you can automate on your side, like, oh, sending notifications, this has been approved. Maybe adding some stuff to a calendar of events, like, hey, this has been approved, and maybe scheduling something to go out.
Yeah, yeah, I like it. That's really cool.
All right. Well, that's it for me today. Let's check out your question.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and start sharing my screen. So we released worker pools a while ago. I believe it was in July or close to the middle of the start of July. And it was really, I thought it was really, really cool, like the way that you can offload a lot of work. And a lot of things that you would previously have done on, say, like a jump box server, you can now be done in a worker pool. And so I have this process, and I'm gonna go ahead and just escape out of this. I have this database deployment process that I set up. And you can see I run some scripts, and then I start like an auto approve script, and then I dive right in and I start doing all this work on the database worker pool. And the reason I can do this is because I'm using SQL authentication. I'm not using integrated security. A good common practice that we have is doing deployments where it's like each environment has its own service account or something like that. Have you kind of run into something like this?
Yeah, especially with customers that have like segmented networks, where it's like when I deploy to dev, I have to use these accounts or the targets. The database jump box has to be different for
Mm-hmm.
each environment.
Yeah, I could see that, especially if you're going to different. Yeah, that's actually a really good point. You could be going to different data centers, so having some sort of server, like a worker pool inside of those different data centers, would be really handy as well.
Yeah, definitely. This actually came up. I talked to a customer this week on this specific thing, so this is good to capture on video.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so now this is something that it's not as well known, and there is a way you can have a worker pool per environment. So what I did, I'm going to walk you through how I have it set up. So what I have is I have a couple worker pools. I have my default worker pool, Kubernetes worker pool, database, Azure. Those are the standard. I don't really care where they're going to be running. I don't care about the targets. I just want to do a deployment, call it good. But then I have these other worker pools that I created called dev, testing, staging, and production. However, if you were going back to this random quotes database process, I have to pick a worker pool. Like, this isn't a variable that I can scope. No, I have to pick one of these items. But what you can do is there's this other target that's out there, this other target type that's out there called cloud region. I've added these cloud regions, and what you can do with the cloud regions themselves is you can scope them to an environment, and you can scope them. You could give it a target role, and then you supply the actual worker pool that you want the work to be done on. And so instead of targeting a worker pool when you do your deployment, what you're going to be doing is targeting the role itself. So in this case, it's DB workers. And you can also use it for tenanted deployment. So if you're using tenants and you have a tenant, like a data center represents a tenant, then you could do something like this as well. So it allows you to really kind of segment out your worker pools a little bit more. And so what your process would look like then is, if I come over here, it's a different project. And now you see it's targeting the role itself. So before I had it running on a worker, and now I have it running on the deployment target, and I'm just targeting that role.
Okay, so you have it set to run on each deployment target directly, not run on a worker on behalf of each deployment target.
Yes, that is correct.
And that's just like a way that cloud regions work like differently than other targets.
Yep. So like if I were to do this, then if I'd said run on a worker on behalf of a deployment target, then I have to pick a worker pool to run it on. But by doing this, I can just say, hey, run this on DB workers. So what it ends up looking like is, I'm going to go ahead and create a release. And let's hope that I have everything set up and working at this particular point in time. I'm going to give it another version, 16. deploy to dev. And so what will happen when I do this is if we look at the task log when it's running, once it picks it up, is you can actually see, okay, I'm going to create a worker if not exists. And it picked out dev worker region. But if I go into the raw task log, we actually get to see create user, at least the worker database worker pool from the dev worker database worker pool. So it did all that stuff behind the scenes for you.
Yeah, that's really interesting because this is a question that comes up a lot, especially with workers, segmented networks and everything. People say like, how do I choose a different worker pool per environment? Is that something is this going to be the way to do it forever? Or like, I think we have some work to create a worker pool variable. Is that still ongoing?
I think so. I think that's part of the thing for workers v2. That would be something we'd have to double check on.
Yeah.
But for right now, I mean, this is the way that you can handle this. And the other thing that I was going to say is just be forewarned if you had multiple cloud regions for that particular environment, it will run on all the cloud regions for that environment. So I believe in this case, I had it set up, or maybe that might be an older release. So just like any other deployment target, if I have multiple cloud regions, so if I were to say come in here and I were to say this one is also for dev. Actually, I'm going to do testing. Yeah, I'm going to say this one is also for testing. So let's go ahead and do that real quick because I'm just going to promote that last release up to test. It's going to run on both of those targets. So that's something just to kind of keep in mind.
Yeah, because we selected the run on a target with this role, not the run on a worker. So it's using a worker behind the scenes, but it's treating it as running on a target.
Yep. So you can see it's running on both the workers,
which is probably not ideal for database deployments.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah, as you can see, they definitely didn't like that. It probably got in a fight with each other. I know why that failed. Yeah, I know why that failed. So yeah, so that's just something that you're going to run into. But yeah, that is just it's a way that you can leverage cloud regions, which I mean, I knew that it was there, but I never really configured this until I want to say about 3 or 4 weeks ago. I started doing this, and then I wrote a blog post on database deployments on how to, and then at the very, very end, I kind of tacked this piece on. And so now anytime I talk to a customer, I've been sending them that blog post, but I think this is, seeing it in video really helps out. So that's why I wanted to cover this question.
Yeah, because there are, just like, it's similar to the scenario I had where it's like, it's not necessarily a standard process, but it is somewhat supported. There are some caveats that if you're just kind of trying to figure it out, you may run into, like you mentioned, having 2 cloud regions with the same role in the same environment can be an issue.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily I wouldn't have thought to look there in as cloud region as a solution for this.
Yeah, and it's kind of a misnomer in that sense, because really it's just a way of, I want to group something together. And I think at the time when it was originally created, it was intended for cloud style deployments. So old style Azure web app deployments, for example.
Or like a target, like having a region, like, oh, I want to run my AWS scripts against this region. So it represents that region and that's where the scripts are run.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
No, that makes a lot of sense. But now we have this nice way of choosing worker pools per environment.
One nice thing is cloud regions don't count against your license.
That is good. Yeah, because if we were going to say, hey, go ahead and set up a new cloud region for each of your environments for all of these things you may want to do.
Yeah,
it could be a problem.
Yep, because if you're on if you're on standard cloud or data center or HA, you have unlimited workers, so you can have unlimited cloud regions as well. Okay. So if you have an interesting question, please submit it to us, and we'd be more than happy to answer it. We do monitor those various communication ways. So you can submit it to us, you can email it to us, or you can join us up on Slack. We'd be more than happy to answer those. Thank you very much, Ryan, for joining me today. We do miss Derek, miss that Scottish accent.
Yeah, he's on a well-deserved holiday, though.
Absolutely. Yeah, I hope he's having a lot of fun.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, Bob. Talk to you next time.
Yep. Talk to you next time. Bye.